the road. Before we get started, I want to take a few moments to go over some basic administrative details. So as you have noticed upon joining the webinar, everyone has been placed on mute for the presentation. At the end of the presentation, there will be a Q&A session. So in the chat room of the Zoom application, you can submit your questions throughout the webinar. Just make sure that you include enough context information that our speakers know what your question is talking about so they can give you the best answer possible. The slide deck, along with the recorded webinar, will be emailed to all registrants following the live event. And without any further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. We've got Heidi, who's the Assistant Director of Medical Policy and Prior Authorization Transformation Lead at Cambia Regence, Cambia Health Solutions, and Raj, who's the Associate Vice President of Technology and Interoperability and Subject Matter Expert on the HL7 Da Vinci Project's Fire Standard with MCG Health. Without any further ado, I'd like to go ahead and hand it over to Raj.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
You sound great.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. It's absolutely a privilege for me to co-present with Heidi from Regence, and we also call them Cambia. Have been working with them for a long time. So today's agenda, we are going to go a little further than the typical prior authorization automation presentations related to Da Vinci. We would like to share a little bit more of how to prepare your organization to implement change of this magnitude and what kind of things we have seen. And how do we define success when you're dealing with providers who have lost confidence in this kind of commitments we make about automation. Examine the tactics required when you deal with multiple partners to complete this workflow and automation. And you also evaluate where your organization began this process and how do you do the incremental updates for the long-term sustainability and success. So these are the areas we wanted to touch based on the work we have been collaboratively doing with Regence. So just to level set, I'm going to go through the next 3 or 4 slides quickly so that everybody understands why we are doing and what we are doing. And it's a very well-known fact right now that the current prior auth burden is very well defined in the industry, where 86% of the providers say that the current burden is extremely high. And just to give you the measure, the survey says 14 hours per week to complete 33 prior authorizations by providers. And they're spending a lot of time outside taking care of the patients. And also you can see the relevant costs the providers are putting up to make this process work. And in 2019, it's probably outdated at this point, but around $528 million spent on this effort. And in the recent survey, when it was asked, is electronic prior auth a priority? And you can see some consensus from the payers and providers and EHRs saying that, yes, it's absolutely a priority. And the numbers you see are like above 80%. And it speaks volumes in terms of what everybody is thinking about this and what needs to be done. So 85% across payers, 83% across providers, and then among the EHRs, it's even higher. So back in December 2020, CMS came up with this new rule to reduce the provider and patient burden by improving the prior auth process. And since it was released, it was under, current status was, it was frozen. It is under further review. And because of the facts that we have seen, the burden is high, everybody wants to solve this problem, we expect the Congress to enact this rule in some time, if not this year, maybe next year, because there's a wide industry acceptance that we need to solve this problem. So before we get into the details, just to frame the conversation and get everybody on the same page, we typically take a scenario so that everybody understands what is the scope of the problem of the prior auth we are dealing with here, and then we will go into the details. So this is the clinical scenario in the HL7 da Vinci circles we widely use. We take a patient, in this case, a 65-year-old female with a history of high cholesterol, and refer to cardiologist by the primary care provider because she's complaining about chest pain and the abnormal stress. Dr. Goodhart evaluates Mrs. Mirren and confirms the study findings from the imaging and determines she should undergo a cardiac cath. This is a very typical scenario in the world, and there is a process in which they go through to obtain the prior auth before they do the diagnosis. And this is true for many procedures as well. So in the HL7 da Vinci world, where we are thinking about the prior authorization and the automation, we came up with 3 questions that we ask typically, right? In this particular scenario, does Mrs. Mirren's insurance require a prior auth? And if so, what are the documentation requirements to support this prior auth? And once you submit the required documentation, what is the process to get this one? And this is, typically takes sometimes a day, 3 days, 10 days, 30 days, right? There is no time limit. And even though there are some regulations around this, this is where the pain today, that the amount of time providers are spending, and matter of the fact, even the payers are spending on their side. So when HL7 da Vinci tackled this process, they looked at like who's initiating an order or a in this case, for the cardiac cath, a provider initiates on behalf of the patient, and then payer response, whether it requires prior auth. If so, what are the documentation requirements? And the third step is that when provider submits all the information and the payer affirms the decision. So this is the scope of this particular webinar for this particular prior authorization burden and automation and the efforts we are doing using HL7 da Vinci. So going one step deeper than the other webinars that we have shared, this is a difficult problem to solve, because if you think about a multi-dimensional problem space dealing with a prior auth request going from a payer and who's using a given electronic health record system, and then submitting to a provider using an EMR and submitting to the payer, and payer often use a medical management system and sometimes even other systems internally to track the statuses. So when we deal with the parent providers and their own systems and the vendors that are involved in between, and the transaction has to flow from a provider all the way to payer and then comes back, you deal with set of challenges in this integration. That is why this problem is very complex. So from the payer side, you have to look at what are the systems involved in making this decision, and what kind of policies I typically use when I ask the provider for additional documentation, and how can I share those policies with providers, and what does automation mean for in this whole problem space, right? If they're not getting any benefit from the existing process, and there is less incentive for providers to use this. So if providers are committing that we are going to turn around in X amount of time comparing with the previous process, that's when there is an incentive. So we are working with payers to think about automation of most of the steps on the payer side. And in addition to that, they have a lot of member history data on the payer side they can leverage, not needing to ask for additional documentation in certain cases. And they can leverage that information to make the decision. On the provider side, you deal with the EMRs, right? You have a EMR, and whether it is Epic or Cerner or Allscripts or Athena, whatever you're using, you need to have a native experience for your providers, so they are not going outside the EMR to submit these prior auth requests. That's where they're spending, as we have seen, 14 hours per week for 33 prior auths. That's enormous money they're spending on it. And the other important thing in this HL7 da Vinci, when we define these requirements, how do we capture the clinical context for this patient from the EMRs so that payers can, to some extent, evaluate the data and automate the decision process. So this data is in different forms and shapes right now on the provider side. End of the day, we wanted to prove there is a value in what we are delivering. So both providers and payers would like to see this is much better than the other versions they have been using. So how do we define those KPIs to the point that we can share those KPIs as we implement these things? So with this, I will hand off to Heidi from Regence to walk through what their organization has done. Heidi, go ahead. I think you're on mute, Heidi. You're still on mute. Sam, can you hear Heidi?
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, that's good.
I couldn't get off mute. The host had to unmute me. So I was waiting for her. Okay. Thanks, Raj. Thanks for the overview of prior authorization and just the recognition, I think, from all sides of the burden that it poses, not only for the providers, the members, but also just from the health plan perspective, which is what I'm representing as part of Regence and Cambia Health Solutions. So I wanted to talk through just our organizational journey that we've partaked in. I'll talk a little bit about the history of how we've gotten to where we are today, and then where we want to go as we move forward. And then also really wanting to touch on just the importance of the provider engagement in all of this. So I wanted to start with just Regence's organizational readiness. As a company, in 2018, our CEO actually really had a strong vision to transform prior authorization just for everybody involved, but more importantly for the patient and our members. And so he, as an executive, really set forth a strong vision to not improve it incrementally, but really transform it. So we had a group of cross-departmental staff from the various areas involved in prior authorization that he formed. And in that year, we really laid out our roadmap and our vision of really getting to that transformational effort. As part of that, we established an interoperability governance group because we really recognize the importance of technology and interoperability in order to get to our endpoint of what we were doing to transform prior authorization. And then more formally this year, which I'm really excited about, we formed our prior authorization transformation program. So I am chairing that program, and we have a steering committee we've established from our respective business areas with strong executive support to really drive the financial and staffing commitment that we need. And over there on the right on the graphic, you can see at a very high level, our vision for our prior authorization transformation program, which is really to start moving our providers through each of these squares here. So, our first step was let's get off of the fax machines and get into an electronic authorization workflow. We knew that would be outside of the EHR and not ideal, but we felt like that was a really important step. And then from there, where we're at today is really now starting to move those providers from that electronic authorization workflow outside the EHR and then moving them into the EHR and really envisioning, if the provider wanted to a point of care interaction with our member at the time that the member is in that provider's office space. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll talk about our roadmap. So this is just a visual of kind of where we've been and where we're going. So our next step, once we really outlined our vision, we knew was to really establish a strong electronic prior authorization workflow. We actually embarked on this in 2018 and went live with our first version of our electronic authorization workflow, which was a basic PA and eligibility check that the providers could do through our tool. We had to build out a clinical edits database and several other databases to drive that work. And then shortly thereafter, we started collaborating with MCG and their site AutoAuth product so that we could load our medical policies into that tool and make our criteria visual to the providers. And then when we have certain logic and rules in the background, and we can actually allow for auto approvals on some of our policies if the providers actually select applicable criteria and that criteria is met. So that was a really big accomplishment for us in 2018 and 2019. And then that really completed that foundational step of having everything electronically. This was also really important work because it allowed all of our different team members to really come to the table together. I think oftentimes in the health plan, it's so large that we're working in silos, and it really made a lot of these different areas interact with each other and understand their business processes and steps to complete the process. And then the third piece of that was really bringing in our technical teams so that they could additionally understand, because they had to build these out for us electronically. So that gave us a really strong foundation as an organization to really propel forward quickly here over the last couple of years within really trying to achieve that interoperability goal. So the next step was really engaging in the Da Vinci work that was happening. And so we have several technical experts that regularly engage with the Da Vinci meetings, the connectathons, and different opportunities that present, so that we can internally have that expertise in order to meet those standards. The next step on here was really internally thinking through what were we going to internally build moving forward, and then what kind of tools did we want to purchase or use to accomplish our vision and goals. And I'll talk about that more as we move forward here. And then we really recognized that in order for us to make this successful, we really needed strong provider engagement and collaboration to ensure we were meeting their requirements and that the providers would actually want to adopt this workflow. And I often say internally, and Raj has heard me say this many times, is, we've established this electronic authorization workflow outside of the EHR. That's really great. But now we've got to drive them into the EHR workflow, and it needs to be even better. And then the next piece here on our roadmap was a really more in-depth assessment of our business areas and really getting commitment. So as I talked about, we had that executive level commitment and engagement. But then it was really taking it to the next step and really engaging with our teams and their staff and ensuring that they have the time to commit to truly build something impactful. And the last one is project management support. And I know Raj would agree with this. On both of our sides, we have really strong project management support, which has been really critical. Given the complexity of this work, we've got our EHR vendors, we've got the plan here, we've got our provider collaborators, and then we've actually had some contractors that we've utilized internally as well. So there is a lot of moving pieces and really a complex workflow. So you can go to the next slide, Raj. Okay, so then our next step after we really laid the foundation internally was trying to figure out who were the right pilot providers. We knew there was going to be, time commitment, and this was going to be a really strong iterative process. And so we developed a framework to think through how we were going to select our provider partners. And this is just at a very high level, a few of the key things we thought through. So the first one was, do we already have an existing strategic relationship with us? And how willing are they going to be to collaborate on something like this and commit their staff to it? And I think there's some trust there too, that if they commit the staff and the resources, that we're truly going to produce something impactful in the end that will reduce that administrative burden of prior authorization. Secondly, we really wanted to find a provider that was really innovatively driven, that would really like to come to the table with us and really try to lead this effort and lead it for the nation. So that was an important piece for us. And then a third piece, which was very large, was really evaluating their readiness for this and more in depth as far as interoperability goes. Did they have the right staffing, the expertise? And if not, how do we solve for that? And then also looking at their use of prior authorization and value-based arrangements. We really wanted to ensure that if the providers are going to spend the time with us on this, that they're going to get value for this in the end. So do they have large utilization of prior authorization so they can realize hopefully the administrative benefits this workflow will provide to them? And then also, are they in value-based arrangements? This was important to us because we knew as a payer that we really wanted to go broader than just prior authorization. We knew there was use cases in our value-based arrangements, and we're also evaluating different things within our quality metrics. And so that was also something that was important to us. You can go to the next slide, Raj. Okay, with that framework in mind, then we really went out to engage a few of our providers that we really felt like met that framework. So these are just a few of the steps that we took. We met with senior leadership to ensure that they had organizational alignment and were willing to commit the time and resources. Like I talked about before, we really had a more in-depth assessment of their technical capabilities, and then really had to think through if there were gaps, how we would bridge those. And I would say, one of the biggest learnings that we had is neither one of us really had to work with an EHR system from a technology perspective, and that was one of the gaps that we needed to solve for. And then we talked about these different use cases that might, solve some of the challenges that they have and reduce some of their administrative burden using the Da Vinci standards. And like I said, really strong use cases in agreement with them around value-based contracts, and then also our prior authorization workflows. The next step we took is we, in our level of engagement with Da Vinci, we're allowed to have 2 provider sponsors. And so we actually did sponsor the 2 organizations that I'll talk about here in a second to be able to participate and glean some of the value of those meetings. And then lastly, really establishing and committing our execution leaders. And these are not the executive level people, but this is more of the leaders of those staff that will be in these meetings, iteratively meeting with us multiple times per month, and sometimes more than once per week. And really this involved their prior authorization staff, because they are the ones in the weeds. They understand the workflow, the requirements, and what's going to meet their needs. And so that was a really important step in all of this. Okay, Raj, you can move to the next slide. So just really quickly, I'll highlight our 2 use cases here that we are collaborating with providers on. So the first one is multi-care. We had an existing really collaborative partnership with them. They actually have been very active within the Da Vinci project and the Connect-a-thons. So that was an added bonus. And then they really have good leadership recognition around how this workflow can potentially reduce their prior authorization burdens, and then also the value-based arrangement data sharing. Now I would say success metrics were somewhat similar, but a little bit different between our 2 pilot providers. They really wanted to complete a prior authorization within the EHR. They really wanted faster turnaround times, and they would also say that they are interested in point of care decisions for some services as they're able to do that. And then they also really wanted to reduce their burden of clinical documentation requirements. And this is a space where, for each of our policies, we have requirements that have to be submitted clinically in order to demonstrate medical necessity. And there's a lot of back and forth sometimes that can happen in that space. And so they really wanted transparent documentation requirements at the point of when they're submitting that prior authorization that's easy, accessible, and fast. And then the second use case is with Oregon Health and Science University, which is right in our backyard here in Portland, Oregon. We have an existing collaborative relationship with them. They really strive to be a leader in innovation, so that was a great fit with this project. They really wanted to reduce the burden of PA. And they really are focused on being able to conduct a PA check within their EHR, and really auto-populating as many fields as possible with the least amount of clicks as possible. And then also looking at faster turnaround timeframes of getting decisions so they can move forward with care. Next slide. Okay, so we laid our foundation. We engaged our 2 pilot providers. We had agreement with those organizations. So now this is kind of where we're at and where the rubber does hit the road. So we're working in coordination with, obviously, MCG and Raj. We're working really closely with Epic, who is our first EHR that we're going to launch this with. And then our 2 pilot providers. So our first step was really truly understanding the PA workflow. So we had ours documented internally, but we had not had it documented by our providers. And so really understanding what the steps are that they go through in order to really match what is the best workflow that's going to meet the needs of the provider, but also for the payer to get the desired outcomes that I just talked about. one of the things that really came out, and I included this on number 1, which is future requirements, is that these providers really want to take this workflow beyond just PA submission. They want to have that active clinical data exchange happening. So if we get a PA and not all the clinical requirements are submitted with that prior authorization, then we actually will pen that PA and ask for that additional clinical information. And that sometimes can be a phone call where we got to pick up the phone and call them. They call us back. There can be a lot of time wasted in that process. And so that's going to be kind of our next step, is really taking this beyond just a submission, but looking at the clinical data exchange. How can we do that? And then also surfacing that PA determination as quickly as possible back through the EHR. Okay, so then I'm going to jump down to number 3 here. We kind of figured out what our workflows were, what our desired outcomes were. We are in the process right now of finalizing our wireframes. We've already had several meetings with our providers to sign off on those wireframes. And then the other thing here in number 4 was extremely important and really exciting. We really wanted the providers to have a quick and easy way in their EHR to access this workflow. So we were actually able to provide an app in the Epic App Orchard that we are calling our Smart Auth app. And so here very shortly, we're going into active build. I'm really excited in a sense that I talked about that foundation with electronic authorization. So we really feel like because we've already built this out pretty extensively, we are really hoping our build will go fairly quickly here. We've already started some of it, but we're really hoping to launch this by the end of the year is the goal, maybe Q1, but we should hopefully be there and testing and going live hopefully very soon. And then obviously the providers will take it from there and implement it within their workflow. And I think just to call out, and Raj can touch on this a lot more as he goes into the automation of the clinical requirements, but just to call out to say the EHR documentation is going to be incredibly important to the success of this workflow. So when the providers are documenting within the EHR, they really need to document in those places that we are pulling the information from in order to get the right information at the right time. So Raj, I'm going to turn it over to you. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I apologize. Actually, sorry, one more slide. I threw this in last minute because I thought it was helpful to visualize the workflow just a little bit more and what I'm talking about. So this is a graphic that I developed. And so let me just orient you very quickly. The left side is the member and provider. You know, the provider may be seeing the member in the office. On the far right side, you can see I have Regence as a health plan there. And then in the middle here is what we're envisioning as far as the workflow goes within the EHR. So I already talked about our Cambia Smart Auth app. So what we're envisioning is the provider would be able to enter a code. We'll go through a PA check that'll also include an eligibility check for that particular member. We'll tell them if that code requires prior authorization or not. If it does, then we'll seamlessly, pull up the applicable policy related to that procedure code. And then we will auto-populate the clinical requirements from the EHR as many as we can. There's going to be some difficulties with this that Raj can touch on just a little bit more, but we're going to populate as much as we can. For those things that we can't auto-populate, we'll still show them that requirement on that same screen, and then they can upload additional data as needed and then hit the submit button. Our goal as a payer and organization is to auto-determine as many PAs as we can, and then really look at the codification to help us do that and to assure that we are auto-approving where we do have those codified policy requirements coming in and we know that those medical necessity criteria are met. And then what we're trying to do is do more targeted audits in the background. And then you can see that connection down here through the bottom with the member, provider, and Regence. So again, if we can auto-approve, we'll send that back as quickly as possible. Hopefully in our future state next year, it would go back through the EHR. And then we're also working internally on our real-time communication with our members, which is really exciting. So Raj, I'll turn it over to you to talk more about the automation that I've referenced several times here.
Yeah, thanks, Heidi. It's important to note that, when we say the rubber meets the road, as we are talking about, what does it take to transform the organization, a lot of times as a technologist, I would think, where is the solution? Show me if it works or not. I think that's a piece of the puzzle. It's more about what Heidi was saying. Where did you start in your organization? What are the organizational readiness elements of executive leadership, awareness, education, commitment to build the tools, commitment to work with the providers and bring them on board? There is a lot of groundwork over the years we have done together, and Regence has done tremendously to get this far. So as we are thinking about, what is the one value we would bring to the providers, is that if we can give them the decision, in a manner that when they're within the workflow, or when they're submitting it, as fast as we can respond, that's where the value, we believe, that's where we can build the trust between the payers and providers. So what is critical for the automation when we think in the prior auth context is, you need to know what the clinical context for the request you're asking. This information is in all places right now. So if we can get the clinical context for the particular auth request, and if we have all the payer rules, like what are the things that they would look for before they affirm the decision, if we can take these two elements and then use technology, and then we will have an auto, the prior auth decision in an automated fashion way, right? So these are the two things when we develop the underlying technology and framework with Regence that we are looking at. So as an example from the clinical context side, so when Cambia says that for this particular auth request, I would like to get this set of data elements, right? Typically it comes as a policy, or we call in a HL7 Da Vinci world a questionnaire, right? So when we think about a set of questions that are representing what is the prayer criteria to the provider, we don't want providers to feel, here comes another document I have to fill. This is nothing better than fax and portal, right? So this is where we are trying to make leaps and frogs, right? We would like to turn that criteria, and then we look at all the data elements that are in the EMR. And when rubber meets the road means that when we are examining the policies from Cambia side, for example, whatever the top one they have picked, we looked at, what are the discrete data elements for this policy that I can identify with an EMR relatively easily, right? What are the other criteria that you have that would require a document like a PDF or an image or something else? And sometimes the policy would require some information that is typically you find in doctor notes, right? So when we look at a policy, we look at what is discrete, what is structured, and what is, what are the other elements? And this is where the negotiation with the payer, right? So, these are the things that are readily available in the EMR. These are the things that you would be getting as a document to start with, right? Again, this is not a magic, silver bullet that everything happens overnight. You start somewhere, right? So we take the policy, we look at what is structured data, you get the data, and you tell the provider that you can enter as much information as possible in the EMR so that we can extract that information. But they may not change their whole process overnight. So you have to start somewhere. You get what you get, and then you keep incrementally, adding things to that list on the EMR side. So when we look at a policy, we look at all these three dimensions. We look at, what is the minimum that you need to make a decision, right? Are there scenarios that you can do it? Are there policies that you're approving anyway 95%? Can we just take that as an example and use structured data that is available to make the decision? We are doing a lot of work on this side. MCG has built a very sophisticated codification process that we can take a policy, we can turn that into a computable expression to get that information from EMR and tell whether we have all the information needed to make the decision. So as I outlined before, in addition to the one I just talked about on the clinical context, we are doing a lot of other things which are very challenging from the integration perspective. And every time we get a request on the payer side, we need to make sure we can do eligibility check. We can look at whether this provider belongs to the network for this payer, and then those two are, I would say, relatively less complex. But the next step is that where do I find the policy for this particular diagnosis or procedure, and finding that information from the payer side is complex. And then once you have all that information, the provider is waiting for the status, right? Sometimes the status comes synchronously. That means when you submit, it comes. But that's really not a scenario that you can promise. It typically comes after a day or after a certain number of hours. In such cases, if a payer initiates a response saying that I have approved or I need more information, how do you communicate that information to the provider system asynchronously? So we need to solve all these technical integration challenges on the payer side. On the provider side, we need to not only look for the technical challenges, there are competing priorities given the COVID situation. So we have to be very careful using their time at this moment. And we have to look at what is their existing workflow, and at what point they're going outside the EMR to launch the portal, versus where within the workflow that we can plug in this particular prior auth automation natively. And then if the thing's coming back from the payer, how would they know, right? Do they have to watch the queue to see what is the status? And we need to figure out all those things within the provider workflow so that it seems very native to them based on what they're doing. In addition to all these things, the challenge is the standard support. We do have HL7 FHIR standards defined by the Devonshire group, but not all the EMR support that as of today. There are bits and pieces there, but we are actively working with the providers to get whatever we need to make that work. So I'll hand off to Heidi to talk about how do you measure what we are delivering.
Yeah, thanks, Raj. So I talked about this a little bit, but really what we wanted to do was outline how do we measure value? How do we know that what we're developing, as I talked about, if these providers spend all this time and engagement with us, is really going to impact their workflows. So this is really what it really boils down to, I think, on both sides. To start, and then I'll talk about the providers and then the payer perspective. So on both sides, at Regence as a health plan, we work very hard to make sure that everything we do is transparent. So we have everything publicly posted, all of our edits on our codes, our policies. All the codes that require PA are actually grouped with the actual policy they're relevant to. But this actually just takes it to a whole nother level of making it available within the EHR, which I think is really exciting. And then as I talked about, really having that actionable data. So for OHSU, a PA check, knowing if something requires prior authorization or not quickly within the EHR, even when the member is there, so the provider can talk about options. Is extremely important. We are serving our members, and that is always, for Regence as a health plan, our center focus. And then obviously reducing the administrative burden on both sides is really important. Reduced turnaround timeframes for PA. This has been something that's really important to us as a health plan. We want our members to get answers quickly so they can plan for their own care. And then all of this will lead to hopefully higher satisfaction in the end, which is really our end goal. And when I say satisfaction, again, we're Regence as a health plan focused on our members, but also the providers that serve our members. And then as far as benefits for the provider, as I've talked about, for them, it's really accessing the entire workflow within the EHR. And we're going to have more work to do after this year, as I've talked about. It doesn't just end at submitting the PA, but they really want to do that clinical data exchange is needed within the EHR. And then our biggest target for us is really submitting that determination back through the EHR. And there's going to be some more work to be done on that. From the provider's perspective, if we are accessing the EHR, they want to accomplish as much of the PA process through auto-population and not have to click through a bunch of fields and screens and enter a bunch of information. So that's also something we're really working on. I would say in the auto-population space, it would be great if we could just auto-populate everything related to the service, the member. We are in those conversations right now. This has been a little bit of a hard one within Epic, trying to figure out how to surface what the provider is doing at the point of care. So we will continue to work on this one. And then at the end of the day, just having transparent PA and clinical documentation requirements that are easily accessible by the providers when they need them. And then on the payer side, for us, it's as I said, Regence as a health plan is really focused on our members. So getting really timely evidence-based care to our members is important. Codifying those clinical documentation requirements that Raj just talked about. So we have been in a lot of meetings figuring out how much can we codify, what can we not codify, and how do we solve for that? One of the things we're exploring actively here soon is natural language processing, because there's a lot of information within the progress notes that are really important to those PAs. And so how can we leverage that technology to further codify and get those requirements more quickly? And then for us as a health plan, the foundation of interoperability is just a starting place around prior authorization. There's so many other use cases to improve the healthcare administrative burden. I think, as I've talked about with quality metrics, VBAs, and various other use cases. So this is really serving as our foundation. So moving on to the next slide. So we just wanted to talk about, I talked about a little bit of lessons learned from that last slide, but just a few more. I think, regular provider engagement is needed. Again, we want to make sure we're developing something that's truly going to be transformative and meet our providers' needs. And so their engagement is important. I would say that the engagement right now as we go through our requirements, our wireframes, and then when we embark on our testing, it is a staff commitment, and oftentimes these staff members are very busy just submitting the prior authorizations, and so that's been really important. I would say, we didn't anticipate COVID coming, and so that has been really impactful for particularly one of our organizations. And actually, we did have one area that submits prior authorizations that wasn't able to participate in this pilot with us, unfortunately. And then we've had to be very flexible with some of our timelines as well, so that the providers could really focus on their needs and meeting the demands of what's required for dealing with COVID. The next one is obviously every provider has a different workflow for prior authorization, different EHRs. So we had to figure out where we were going to start. As I mentioned, we are starting with Epic first, but then we'd like to move into evaluating other EHRs so that other providers can take advantage of this workflow. So that will be our target for next year. Also, the providers, some have centralized PA systems, some are decentralized. So one of our pilots is more, I would say, decentralized in a sense that the different clinical areas submit their prior authorizations. And so with one of our pilots, we weren't able to engage all the areas with this pilot. So we really had to think through which areas we could engage, and then also targeting those codification of those policy requirements for those particular areas and services that they submit prior authorization on. And then requirements gathering has just been absolutely critical to drive adoption. Like I said, I think we've learned a lot during these last several months of going through requirements. I think too, there's a level set that happens, in an ideal scenario, like I said, when the PA was coming in, we'd be able to auto-populate everything. It would just come into us seamlessly. We are hitting a few roadblocks, so that's not going to be the case. So they are going to have to manually enter in some things and do some extra clicks. So it's how do we meet their requirements? How do we make this better? But we also have to kind of come to an agreement about what's possible right now, given the fact too that we really want to drive this out, hopefully by the end of the year. And then EHR support is critical. So any EHR that we're working with, they also have to come to the table with their resources and commitment to help progress these workflows forward. And Raj, I'll turn it over to you to finish us out.
Yeah, thanks, Heidi. So just a couple of more things. In fact, we have a webinar coming up tomorrow on delivering the ROI for your organization with prior auth automation. So our folks from MCG go much deeper into the metrics that we have inquired with many providers and payers in terms of what exactly that you wanted to measure, and how do they make the difference in terms of implementing these new processes. So feel free to attend. And then if you need more information, feel free to reach us, burdenreduction@mcg.com. Or you can also access many of our webinar series on this at the link you can see here. but feel free to drop us a note and we're happy to share any information you need. And then coming to questions, and I have seen a few questions coming from the chat window. So let me start talking. So I'll ask those questions. So Heidi, probably you can answer this one. I think probably most of them you can answer. Would specialty pharmacies have the ability to access the system and see the status of PAs?
Okay, so yeah, I didn't mention pharmacy. So what I would say for Regence as a whole, our goal is to include pharmacy within this workflow. That will not happen with this pilot launch, but that is our goal. One of our internal roadblocks is they have actually a different system that they work out of than us. And so that's also on our roadmap is we really need to either get into the same system, so medical and pharmacy are on the same system together, or we've got to figure out what that technological build is to bridge the two of those. And that's something we're actively talking about right now within the organization. But our goal full well is to include, and I should say at this point in time, our medical drug pharmacy services.
Thanks for the question. The other question from Kelly, how are the patients qualified for the PA process? Is there a generic Regence insurance type, or did you identify the various regions and Blue Cross Blue Shield plans in the service area and map them to PA workflow?
Yeah, so that's part of the foundational work that we did for our electronic authorization workflow. So we have our clinical edits database that I talked about, and then we also have an eligibility database that drives our answers on whether something requires prior authorization, and it is by line of business.
Okay. So the other follow-up question is, how are procedures qualified as needing PA? Are the CPT codes pre-identified as needing auth, and does the process kicks off when the exam is ordered, scheduled, or manually by the provider before they can order request the exam?
So the first question on qualified as needing PA, so again, that's our clinical edits database. So the provider can just enter in the procedure code that they would like to move forward with. And then we can determine whether or not that requires prior authorization by that member, that line of business, and give them a response on whether it requires prior authorization. If that code doesn't, then they can just move forward with the service and submit the claim. If it does require prior authorization, then they enter into our workflow where we will drive them into that tool that we talked about that we collaborate with MCG, where we have all of our policies loaded. And so we'll drive them over to that tool seamlessly within that workflow. They'll see the policy criteria requirements related to that code, and then they can select through what's applicable, what's not. And then we have logic in the background, so we know based on what they clicked, whether or not that policy criteria is met. And then we have another rules engine that hits after that, that will allow an auto approval if the criteria is met and we have designated that policy to approve, or we'll pend it in for review. So there's certain procedures that we need to pend in for review for various reasons. And I could just call it like a bariatric surgery type of service. We're never going to auto approve those because there's a lot of benefit interaction with that determination. So yeah. Did I get all the questions answered in that one?
There is one question probably both of us can answer. When does this process kick off? When it is ordered or scheduled or manually? How are you?
Yeah. They can, it's really up to the provider. So they could just go in and do the PA check if they really wanted to and back out at that point and be done. Or they could really want to move forward with that service, they could submit it. And then, you know, as I talked about, our ideal state would be if the patient was in the office and they really wanted to know if it required PA, the service that they were partaking in, they could do it with the patient in the office. It's really up to the provider. The tools are all there and they can use it however they need to meet their needs.
Exactly. Yeah. So the ideal is that when the patient is sitting there, when you put the order, this is where we would need EMRs to support some of their technologies so that it automatically triggers this workflow. Right now, we are doing a workaround with the solution we are building. But the goal is they can do it anytime, but the ideal goal is to launch at the time they order. The other question is, for decades, physicians have used notes as the clinician component of the chart. Automation requires discrete data elements entered into the EMR database. What are the EMR vendors doing to assist physicians in moving the direction? NLP lacks the reliability and feels like the tail wagging the dog comments. So how are we helping the EMR vendors or working with the EMR vendors to enter that information in the right places so that it's not in everything is in the notes field, but it is in the appropriate data fields to extract that information? Have you had any conversations with the providers on this space?
Not yet, because like I said, we're really just getting our requirements done and really going over the wireframes and then what we're going to require. And then I think, as we move forward and build this out and then start to test, that's when we're planning to have those conversations about the importance of the data being there at the right place at the right time. And then to the other comment about progress notes and various data, that's where we're really going to start looking at different technologies and areas to improve getting that information out of those progress notes.
Yeah, I think from based on my experience working with EMRs, the comment is spot on. But there's a lot of work needs to be done, not only on the EMR side, but even on the provider side, examining their workflows and what they're doing, where the information is coming from. So when we pick the use case, what is the first policy we are planning to implement? And then the questions go both sides, like, for the providers, we need all this information to automate the decision, but are you entering in the right places, or it is in the nodes? So this is where you need an innovative provider who's willing to make some changes, or not necessarily the whole thing. It is a little bit of a compromise from the payer to ask, okay, certainly you can't enter everything, but at least I need this level of data elements, discrete data elements. So we are in this process as we speak at this moment. The other piece is with NLP, it may not precisely tell you have all the information, but we approach this as if you look at the car automation, they call 5 levels. Every level is assisting you to make the decision. At the 5th level, it auto drives, right? In the same way, in the NLP world, we are coming with the technology where we assist the person who is documenting, hey, I found all this information in this note. This may be relevant to this indication for this particular criteria. So we wanted to reduce that gap, not having them to read 60 pages to make a determination, and bring it down to probably reduce that time. So this is the very early where we are experimenting some of these things to see if it adds the value. Heidi, perhaps the last maybe 2 more questions. What was Regence rationale to choosing the DaVinci versus X12 278?
Yeah, and I can follow up with this with some of our technical teams more so, but I think the CMS rule, when it came out, our technical teams really went into really wanting to use DaVinci Fire standards to really have that consistent interoperability across all these different systems that we talked about.
Yeah. How will a clinical laboratory know if a PA was obtained?
So when we get prior authorizations today, what happens is when we make the determination, we send a letter out to the organization, we send a letter to the member. And so that would be the same. If you submit the PA, then we're determining the response. And then in an ideal state, as I talked about next year, what we're really looking to do is to incorporate that workflow within the EHR as well.
Okay, awesome. The last question, does the system check against benefit limits as well?
That's a loaded question. So we do our benefit check. There is some benefits where we can't do the limit per se. And this actually comes in, for our federal employee plan, where we do have to pin those in to just do that last quick check to make sure the limit is being met before we authorize it.
Awesome. So with that, thank you very much for attending this session. We hope that it is certainly valuable. We plan to share the next one probably in a few months based on our journey. We are very excited part of this whole venture. With that, Sam, you can take it from here.
Thank you so much for a fantastic webinar, and I'll be following up with everybody with the link to the recording as well as the slide deck. Feel free to share it among your colleagues or anybody else you think might be interested. Thank you so much, and I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their week.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.